Good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here this evening. I'm Judith McGregor from the Lord Caradon Trust, and it's my great pleasure this evening to be hosting our conversation, an online conversation with Zainab Badawi, and I would like to introduce her to you before we begin this evening's proceedings. It's a real pleasure and a privilege, Zainab, to be introducing you. I think you don't need a lot of introduction. You're an award-winning broadcaster, journalist, and filmmaker, and at the moment president of SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, and a fellow member of the Arts and Humanities Research Council. I know that you, because it's very clear from your book that you were born in Sudan, but you've worked in the British media for decades, and your work is including co-presenting Channel 4 News alongside Jon Snow before you joined the BBC News. And you've interviewed some of the most notable personalities and politicians in the globe on BBC's Hard Talk and Global Questions. And you're a recipient of the President's Medal of the British Academy, a patron of the UN Association in the UK. You are on the boards, as I said, of the Arts and Humanities and Research Council, the Mandela Institute for Development Studies, International Crisis Group, and Afrobarometer. And on top of that, you were previously chair of the Royal African Society. And most recently, you've become an acclaimed author with your book, Africa, From the Dawn of Humanity to Independence, An African History of Africa, which I think is selling very, very well. I see it everywhere. I bought my copy in Waterstones on their presentation desk at the front of the shop, and it's being sold also worldwide. And I know you've been also running a television series about Africa, 20 episodes of all the different places that you have been to and met. So I feel we're really in the hands of an expert in terms of having visited Africa over the last 7 years when you were preparing your book and visiting something like 30 countries, I think. And it's a fabulous book, which I think has a big mission in itself to educate and inform us much more about Africa. So without further ado, perhaps I can ask you just, our theme tonight is Africa Today, future opportunities and possibilities. And you've been writing, I think, about that. You've been looking at the past, but we're very much with a thought to how that has influenced the present and, of course, the future. So for the benefit of everybody watching, Zainab is very kindly going to speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll take some questions. I've got some questions already, but if you have any, please put them in the chat, in the comments, and we'll try to get to them. And if I don't get to them, my apologies. But Zainab, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much indeed, Judith, and all your colleagues at the Caradon Trust. It's a great pleasure to be with you and all of you who are joining this event online. Yes, Judith, you're right. I was born in the Sudan, but I've lived in the UK since I was 2 years of age. But Africa has never really left me, and I have a deep love for the continent. And I suppose that's because my engagement with the continent has been through the love for my parents, who, of course, were Sudanese. My father's no longer with us, sadly, but my mother, 95, going on 96, and still going strong, touch wood. And I dedicated the book to both of them. Now, what I wanted to talk to you all about really was really trying to recast the narrative of Africa. And you might think to yourself, why on earth are you talking about history rather than addressing Africa in the present if you want to do that? But I want to give you a couple of examples from history, which I think are relevant today, because in my view, history doesn't just explain the past, it also informs the present and indeed helps us shape the future. And I wanted to address what I thought were the vacuum, really, the ignorance about the continent. I've developed a party trick now, which I say to people, name me an African king or queen. And, invariably people say Tutankhamun. Mm-hmm. And then invariably they say, but were the ancient Egyptians really African? Now, those answers are very telling. Tutankhamun, yes, of course, we all know him. Very insignificant king, did nothing really, just famous because of his treasures. And then the fact that people say, but were the ancient Egyptians really African? I think there's a bit of an idea there, which has lasted for a very long time, that, you know, people who are African, whatever that may mean, perhaps could not have been responsible for such a great civilization. And I think that that speaks to the fact that people have an idea of what an African is or should be or even looks like, whereas Africa is the most diverse continent, you know, in the world, and it faces the Mediterranean in the north, and of course there were influences from Western Asia and the southern Mediterranean, and, you know, along the Atlantic coast, and all these different influences are present in the continent. But everybody who lives territorially in the continent of Africa is African. So ancient Egypt, of course, always was and always will be African. But I want to tell you about a man called Mansa Musa. Mansa is the name for the kings of Mali, the great empire of Mali. Now, what do you think about Mali when if I said to you, you know, conjure up what ideas you have today? You'd say the coups, the extremism in the Sahel that's overrun the place. It's very, very poor. You know, the countries of the Sahel, like Mali, like Niger, and so on, and Chad, you know, these are conflict ridden and so on. But let me tell you about a very famous Malian from history. So Mansa Musa was born in 1280, and he was the great nephew of a man called Sundiata Keita, who was the founder of the Mali Empire. The Mali Empire was founded in 1235. And Sundiata Keita set out something called the Mandi Charter, because he was from the Mandi people. And this was dated to 1236. We know this because Arabs were present in the Mali Empire and they recorded the date. So this was an oral charter that espoused equality, civic rights for everybody, and, you know, very, very enlightened. So Mansa Musa was the great nephew of the founder of the Mali Empire, and in about 1324 to 25, he decided to embark on a pilgrimage to Mecca because, of course, he was Muslim, and he left his capital in Niani, which is on the border of Mali and Guinea in modern parlance. And he set off with his household of about 12,000 people, accompanied by 60,000 porters, 500 personal servants, all decked in silk and, you know, laden with gold. He also had about 100 camels, and they were all weighed down with the gold that they were carrying, probably between 10 to 20 tons in total. On his journey to Mecca, Mansa Musa stopped in Cairo, and on the way back, he also had a sojourn in Cairo. And there he spent so much money and gave away so much gold that the price of gold plummeted by 25% and didn't recover its previous value for more than 10 years. Now, why do I tell you that story? Because it shows you how, at a time when England was being plagued literally by, you know, the Black Death, this is what was going on in Mali. The empire consisted of about 400 towns. Mansa Musa used his riches to develop and build 3 mosques, the Great Mosque of Timbuktu, using an Andalusian architect. And in fact, he is reckoned to have been the richest individual to have ever lived in history, period. He would be worth about 430 billion US dollars in today's terms. So, you know, this is what my research uncovered when I went to Mali. Now, why do I like that story? I like it because it shows you how places that we think of as destitute today in Africa were not always like that. We all know that empires rise and fall, of course. But, you know, that's an important lesson to learn about Africa. It wasn't always, you know, burdened by the problems that we see today. But also this idea that Africa stood on the sidelines of history, which is an idea that people think today, that there are those who make history and those who are on the sidelines. This story of Mansa Musa shows how actually Africa the Mali Empire was integrated into the global economy to the extent that, as I said, that the price of gold plummeted. A Catalan cartographer in 1375, one of the regions, the places that was featured on his map was Mansa Musa, with a, holding a golden orb and wearing a golden crown. Such was his significance. But I think that a lot of people today don't have any understanding of African history, including on the continent itself. And I think that Africa's history, almost uniquely, really, compared to anywhere else in the world, has either been denigrated, written by outsiders, for the most part, Europeans, or Africans have been told they don't have any history. And often we start Africa's history from the colonial era, from when Europeans arrived and started recording, because they feel that because in some instances Africa didn't write, that therefore it didn't have any history. Just because Africans didn't always write, it doesn't mean they didn't have the history. You just have to get at it in a different way. So these were all the objectives I had in both writing my book and making the 45-minute TV series. I wanted to address these kind of stereotypes and to actually really say to people, look, everybody originated from Africa. The science is settled. That's why I start my book, chapter 1, and the TV series also, the first episode, with the origins of humankind, to say, even if you've got blue eyes, flaxen hair, and a pale complexion today, you are an African export. Everybody came from Africa. And actually, the man who I quote is my great friend Richard Leakey, the late Kenyan paleontologist, explained to me, very carefully how up until between 8,000 to 12,000 years ago, everybody was dark-skinned. So I wanted to start the book and the TV series there because I wanted to really talk about our undivided past and to, emphasize our common humanity, our common origins, as a bit of a kind of riposte to all the divisions and the polarizations that we see today. I know it's wishful thinking, but, there we go. I wanted to do that. So, and I think that there are other examples that I look at in my book. I look at, the Kingdom of Benin, and I try in each chapter to look at a modern theme. So I look at restitution, should the bronzes be returned, and so on and so forth. And in that way, I try to show how there's a link between Africa's past and Africa's present. And I'm happy to take questions on Africa's present. I think also what writing the history book showed me is that, you've got to take the long view. When you look at Africa through the millennia, you see how it has changed. And I think that if you take the short-term view of Africa today, you will be fairly pessimistic, and rightly so. I mean, look at the country where I was born, Sudan, mired in conflict between the Sudan Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces, people starving, women being sexually assaulted, and all the rest of it. It's a terrible situation. And you look at the instability in other parts of the conflict. But I feel that if you take the long view, and possibly even as short as 20 years' time, I think you'll have a much more optimistic view of Africa. And I do, and that isn't because I'm sort of, starry-eyed about the continent. It's mostly because it's a very young continent. And, young people, as we all know, have got vigor, they've got energy, they want to achieve, they want to strive. And Africa, the average age is about 19. In some countries, Chad, Guinea, it's as low as 15. When you compare that to the more advanced economies, Japan 49, Italy 47, France 43, the United Kingdom 41, the USA and China 38. The fact that Africa is so young, it means that a quarter of the world's producers, consumers, workers, by 2050, when Africa's population doubles, a quarter of the world's workers, producers, as I said, are going to be African. So I very much see the future being African. And you know, I was very struck in making this TV series and writing the book by how absent Africa has been from our global story. And I also was wanting to redress the fact that when we do hear about Africa or read about it, the African intellectual, the historian, the archaeologist, the anthropologist is very, very absent from that conversation. You know, how strange would it be if we just had history books about English history, Scotland, or whatever, written by, you know, somebody who hails from Africa and has got, you know, a very different name. It would strike you as rather odd. And so, and this isn't, and that's why my book is called An African History of Africa, because I wanted to bring these people's voices, because I think there is something lacking when you don't have a Congolese addressing their own history, or an Angolan their own history, and so on and so forth. And I was very struck by my travels. I went to around 34 African countries and, you know, traversed across these places and spoke to dozens and dozens of historians, anthropologists, archaeologists, cultural experts. And I was very, in a way, I found it quite poignant that I would literally have to tear myself away from every encounter, because they knew I was, you know, from the BBC, they'd seen me in the international media, and they really wanted to tell their story. And so this book is for the general reader. I see myself as an intercessor between the African intellectuals I met and the reader. And I felt that I had to just accord them the respect of them telling their own story. And it's not about supplanting the very good work that's been done by many Africanists, amongst whom I, you know, count many of my good friends. But it's just saying the African historian has a place alongside the Africanist. And I found that, you know, a great inspiration to me in writing the book and also making the TV series was a wonderful project that was conceived in the 1960s by the newly independent African presidents. They said, look, we've decolonized our countries, we want to decolonize our history. So they appealed to UNESCO, the United Nations Education, Scientific and Cultural Organization, which was then, the Director General was then a very enlightened Frenchman called René Mahaut. And he said, okay, I'll facilitate this project if you pay for it. So UNESCO scoured the continent of Africa for the best scholars, and they got them to compile volume after volume after volume of Africa's history. And I used that a great deal as part of my source material. But they differed from the Africanists, the European scholars, because they also drew on the chronicles of Arab writers, Persians. They used oral tradition, archaeology to kind of bolster, you know, their accounts of history. And that's the spirit I try to capture both in the TV series and in the book. And in the book, I don't get to the transatlantic slave trade until about chapter 14 of 18 chapters. And I say that because it is the history which has been occluded, the pre-colonial history, you know, the history of Africa, about which people don't really know very much, that I wanted to emphasize. And it's for the African reader as well as the non-African, because I found that actually a lot of Africans on the continent themselves were really not terribly aware of their continent's history. So it is I think, a near universal, you know, challenge to try to just put Africa's story out there. And if we do that for its history, then it makes it, and try to redress some of the negative stereotypes, then it becomes easier to also do that when we talk about Africa, you know, in the present. It's not just a picture of unrelenting pessimism. a continent cannot be defined only by its problems. I didn't want to look too much at modern day Africa, although I did address it in my epilogue, because I thought, look, you might be able to find a really good, a special report in The Economist or the Financial Times big read or whatever. And I think people are sort of more aware of Africa today. Having said that, they are more aware of the negative aspects of it, the coups, the wars, the famines, perhaps not so aware of many of the positive things that are taking place on the continent today. So those are my introductory remarks. I'm very happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very apropos. Well, the first question that I was asked to ask you was, does this feel like a completed task, mission accomplished? And I think actually you've sort of said that it's only the beginning, really, of a sort of an ability to project a more accurate, effectively, and a more wholesome sort of all-rounded vision of both the past and the present. And also, were there any unexpected surprises or discoveries for you, things that you didn't expect to come across in your researches?
Right, I'll take that one. I found the chapter I wrote and the film I made about Northern Sudan, which is where my ancestors come from, the most surprising, because I think that it hadn't. I knew there were pyramids in Northern Sudan. Northern Sudan had a culture similar to the ancient Egyptian one, but I didn't realize there were 1,000 pyramids in Sudan. There are about 100 in Egypt. About 300 preserve their superstructure. They're smaller than the pyramids in Egypt, and they're different because people were buried in tombs adjacent to the pyramids and not actually inside. I found that quite surprising. I was also, blown away by the statues, the temples, the temple reliefs, the jewelry. I mean, a very, very advanced civilization. It's the kingdom of Kush, and I focus in my book on the 8th century BCE, when the kings of Kush governed Egypt for the best part of a century. And my research led me to discover very interesting facts, like actually the Northern Sudanese, the Kushites at that time, were a kind of regional superpower. They were the protectors of the princes of Byblos and Phoenicia and Jerusalem. And they fought the Assyrians, who were the most, powerful, warlike people of that period of the ancient world. And, fought them and defeated them. They were very accomplished archers. So I found that surprising. And I think that's very, very revelatory. And again, it goes against, what we see Sudan like today. I also was struck by the fact that history cannot be consigned to the past. So one surprising fact was that the Kushites, the ancient Northern Sudanese, did not eat fish. Imagine having the Nile running through your land, full of this source of protein, but they considered it an abomination to eat fish. And to this day, I mean, the ancient Egyptians did eat fish. The ancient Northern Sudanese didn't. And to this day, the Sudanese consume a fraction, the Northern Sudanese, of what the Egyptians eat in terms of fish. And there are, many Northern Sudanese who just can't bear fish, including my brother. And I say to him, now I know why. It's your genetic memory at play. So I liked seeing things which, I observed in the temple reliefs, the statues, the jewelry, that kind of thing, which, from centuries gone by. But I recognized some of these things in my grandmother's home. So I think that was the most remarkable aspect, that revelatory, those revelatory findings that I came, and how history, is still very, very present.
I think generally that richness that you describe and that sort of extent of monuments and scholarship and architecture and archaeology, yes. I don't think it's, I'm a historian, and it certainly wasn't known to me when I was studying that, and I don't think it is still. But what about your mission more generally? I mean, sort of, another question was, that I received was, well, what could the West and African countries do to really, to improve these perceptions, to sort of, is there one thing? I mean, certainly in research these days and science, there is a great eagerness on the part in the UK to work with, in a much more equitable partnership way, with researchers overseas. And that probably is very often and primarily in Africa, because so many of the issues that are being studied are live and actual, and the evidence is there. So it's not in some ways for want of a certain group of people doing that kind of work, but it doesn't seem to sort of spread more widely into popular conception.
No, it doesn't. But you're absolutely right to focus on the science there, because Africa is where 70% of pathogens, occur. It's, that. And a wonderful Cameroonian-born scientist called Professor Christian Happy, who abandoned his laboratory in Harvard, at Harvard University, one of the world's top scientists, and moved and set up a Center for Infectious Diseases in Nigeria. And he was the man who discovered sequenced coronavirus, the first case in Africa, south of the Sahara. And, he wants to make Africa a center of scientific research for the reasons I just said. But if you look at how little money has gone into, the 2%, I think, of the African genome has been, I mean, I'm not a scientist, but this is what he has been telling me, that not enough research has gone into Africa. R&D is still something that's very governed by, a Western agenda. And that means it tends to reflect their concerns and so on. And Africa doesn't value its scientific base enough. I mean, presidents pledged to spend 2% of their GDP on science, but nowhere near that. But I think that that kind of cooperation certainly is something that could be done. Africans and Europeans, the technology, knowledge transfer, never mind about patents. I know the Europeans don't want to give up on their patents, but the knowledge transfer and the technology transfer is very, very critical. And I think it's important, when you think about the challenges that affect the world, that Africa is not just seen as the victim. So, for example, when it comes to climate change, we know that Africa is very badly affected, although Africa accounts for only 3% of carbon emissions. And when you take out the more industrialized north of Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa accounts for 0.5% of global carbon emissions. I mean, tiny. So when you see the debate is generally about, mitigation, don't use so much air conditioning. So on, this debate does not resonate with a lot of Africans, because how can you mitigate 0.5 percentage point? But the Africans are, bearing the brunt of global warming, but they're not just victims, because Africa has a third of the world's mineral reserves, earth minerals, bauxite, lithium, cobalt, all the minerals that we need for the green technology, renewable energy revolution. And so it is very, very much part of the solution. Africans hold an ace in their hand. And I would hope that, and we are seeing signs of this happening, that they are a country like the DRC, Democratic Republic of the Congo, which has about a third of the world's cobalt reserves. Or no, I beg your pardon, 70% of the world's cobalt reserves. They're beginning to review all their mining contracts with foreign corporations to just make sure that, the nation really is benefiting from it. Of course, corruption across Africa is a problem. Whether that revenue is going to be used in an equitable manner is another question. But there are signs of governments becoming a bit wiser. Namibia has banned the export of raw lithium, saying it wants to process lithium so that it can go up the value chain. So there are changes.
You're a professional journalist. I mean, so, sort of obviously how and what we read in the media and what we see is obviously hugely influential on people. I mean, somebody asked me to ask you whether you could sort of talk about what was perhaps in your view might have been the most underrated and neglected sort of success story from Africa, which could have got more widespread coverage in the West if we had known about it. But perhaps we have known about it, but we've interpreted it negatively. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts there
I
in
mean,
the last decade or so?
yes, I mean, I think picking up on this theme of, you know, I think that we all know that technology has transformed our lives in so many ways. The media in which I worked is, completely unrecognizable from the media world that I started in academia now, where I've also dipped my toes, completely different. So we all know that the impact of AI and technology is huge, but I think probably nowhere will that have an impact more than in Africa, in my opinion. And we already see that happening. Partly because, as I said, the population is so young and they're very digitally savvy. So if you take a country like Kenya, they hold the world record for the number of people who use fintech, combination of finance and technology. So 95% of households in Kenya use some form of mobile money. We know that about M-Pesa. Some people know about that. But not just, in fintech, in other areas. Solar powered irrigation in Kenya has led to a 300% increase in agricultural yields. In 2022, they rolled out, electric public buses for, green transport. 92% of Kenya's electricity is acquired from renewable sources.
92.
92% of electricity is from renewable sources. So I think that as we, in the more advanced economies grapple with our mature, infrastructure, creaking infrastructure, our sewer pipes as we have in the UK here, all the problems and, our old decaying infrastructure in North America, whatever. I think that the surprising thing about Africa is that it can, as it did with mobile phones, didn't bother with landlines, just, leapfrogged into that. And I think that that could happen in a number of ways. And Africa can build the cities of the future because the population is rapidly urbanizing. And so I think, as I say, using the medium and the long-term lens, Africa could really be delivering the success story of the world by, building in a greener way, in a more efficient, effective way, rather than, us saying, well, put your heat pumps in, your central heatings. Do you know what I mean? It's much easier if you benefit from all the new technology now. So I think that for me, Africa could very much become the leader. And as I said, it has all the minerals that you need for the green revolution. So I'd like to see, more emphasis on that aspect of Africa. I mean, the media inevitably focuses on negative stories. That's the way it is, not just Africa. There's nothing sinister about Africa in that regard. It's true of anywhere in the world that the media focuses on the bad, alarming news. But I think that if that's all you have, then you think that's all there is there. I mean, imagine if we here in the UK were just defined by our NHS waiting lists, our rivers full of sewage, our housing crisis. If that's all you ever heard about the UK, I mean, you think, my goodness, I'd never want to step foot, there. But of course, there's a lot of poverty in Africa. Of course, there's a lot of instability. 600. I talk about Kenya, but 640 million people in Africa don't have access to electricity. Yeah. So, but I'm just saying that the green shoots of a new Africa are emerging, and that should be looked at.
Let me ask you something completely different. One of the fascinating things about your book are the historical characters that you have unearthed and brought to life. Many of them women. And I love the story about the ground frankincense becoming coal, which Hatshepsut discovered or patented, as it were, and many others. And And I know from my own experience in South Africa that women actually, although they weren't necessarily head of government or head of state, nevertheless were hugely important and hugely sort of prominent in the ANC, for example, in South Africa. Did you sort of, any insights or sort of feelings about the way that, they have always been traditionally very strong in Africa, not always now so visibly as I say, as heads of state or presidents, but, any insights for the sort of the women issues of the West or the UK today? I mean, did anything strike you to sort of, that could be inspirational for us?
Yes, I mean, I think, if you go back to ancient times, women in ancient Egypt and ancient Sudan, Kush, that I looked at, you're looking at many hundreds of years BCE, had very powerful roles to play in society, particularly in Kush, where a queen could rule as a co-regent with her husband or even her son. And there are examples of, for example, Queen Amani Renas, who in 30 BCE led the Kushites into battle against the Romans, who by now had conquered Egypt. And she lost an eye in the battle and put up such a resistance that the Romans were forced to sign a peace treaty with her in 22 BCE. You mentioned Hatshepsut. Women in Egypt could own property in their own right. If you think about Europe, and the fact that women couldn't do that for a very long time, a stark contrast there. Primogenitor here, where a son is a firstborn son inherits everything, or if there isn't one, then all the assets can go to a distant male heir. If you look at a lot of societies in Africa, the Asante, for example, who your mother is really, really matters. And that was the same for the Kushites and many societies in Africa. Chiefs were often, not always, the chiefs were the men, but women really wielded a great deal of influence. You saw that in the Kingdom of Benin. You have strong characters like Queen Kahina, the Berber queen in the 600s, late 600s, who fought off the Arabs, and Queen Ya Asantewa of the Asante people, sometimes known as the Ashanti, who started her war in 1900 against the British, who were really closing in on what became Ghana. And she admonished the men and said, look, what's the matter with you? Why don't you all fight? You should swap your loincloth for my undergarments. And she managed to get an army of 20,000 people, and for 7 months kept the British at bay. Their superior firearms in the end meant that she was defeated, but she managed to keep hold of the golden stool, which is what the kings of the Asante were sort of enthroned on this stool, and that was the soul of the kingdom. And she was one step ahead of the British there by hiding it in a forest so they couldn't obtain the stool. So there are many examples of strong women, and I think that African women today are amongst the most strong, admirable women I've ever come across. I mean, the lovely late Ghanaian writer and women's activist Ama Ata Aidu, who died at the end of May this year. She had a spell as education minister in Ghana. And I've had conversations with her, and she said to me, this idea, and I quote her, of the African woman as being a downtrodden wretch is something I just don't accept. Nawala Saadawi, the Egyptian feminist, who was a medical doctor also, and a writer, the hidden face of Eve, and she really was a champion of women's rights. Born in the early 1930s and received a fine education. A very feisty woman, who was imprisoned for a while for her beliefs, and wrote her memoirs on a lavatory paper using a black makeup pencil. These are women. It doesn't surprise me, these strong women. Or Wangari Maathai, the lovely late Kenyan environmentalist who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2004 because of her environmental activism, well ahead of the game, really visionary, planting trees everywhere, people deriding her for doing that. Sadly, she died in 2011. And, one of the things that she always said that always stuck with me was when she said, you cannot enslave a mind that knows itself that understands itself, that values itself. And I think that's so true because, I think knowledge is freedom. And I think that, we should all value that knowledge we have, that self-awareness. And I've always treasured that comment that she made. So it doesn't surprise me that there are strong African women like the ones I've cited, who I've also had the pleasure of meeting and interviewing in my career as a broadcast journalist. And you again just see these characters throughout history. And I set about deliberately trying to focus on women as well, because I think people take the HIS in history a bit too seriously. His story, not just Africans, but everywhere in the world. The fathers of the independence movement or whatever. And, women are very instrumental. And, again, this thing of history repeating itself, the queens of Kush were known as Candakas. Incidentally, that's where we get the modern women's name Candice from. They were known as Candakas. And in the 2019 revolution in Sudan that brought down Omar al-Bashir, women were very much in the vanguard there, young women, and they styled themselves as Candakas. They said, we are the Candakas, the strong women of Sudan. So I think that people do reach into history for inspiration.
Thank you. Can I turn a bit to the present now? Because I think your book brings out very clearly, sort of through the ages, economic, as it were, drivers to come and to take from Africa, either people or to take minerals or to take resources, and the involvement of outside forces in Africa has obviously been something which has recurred again and again, as well as empires exhausting their resources and then sort of, as it were, sort of declining. You see this in Latin America too. But obviously a lot of press comment at the moment about Africa is concern, for example, in the Sahel, in Mali, in the sort of Central African area, about Chinese investment, Belt and Road Initiative, Wagner mercenaries in those areas, the instability, the sort of continuing instability, and we mentioned Sudan earlier. What is the African perception on this? Is it that we, perhaps, as it were, are we right to be concerned about that? Obviously, one's concerned about conflict wherever it is, but in a sense, is it sort of something of a narrow Western sort of gaze on this when there is more going on in many different countries?
Yes, I mean, all the Africans I've spoken to, or many of the Africans I've spoken to, and I was a couple of weeks ago in Lagos, and I was having this conversation with the head of the Chinese Institute at the University of Lagos, and several of his colleagues. And, and what they say about China is, at least the Chinese do things, at least they build. At least, they're not scared away from the continent because of the instability. I mean, they'll rock up with their own security detail or whatever. And I think the Chinese have learned lessons. When they first went into Africa, they built things in a very shoddy way. You'd hear about a hospital in Angola being washed away in some floods or whatever.
The bridges going, yes.
Exactly. But they now have got wise, I think, and are doing things much better. At least this is what people are telling me. And, they cite, for example, the Mombasa to Nairobi railway in Kenya, which was built by the Chinese. You see studies by Western NGOs that say done a fantastically costly, a budget, and that the Kenyans are going to be, paying off the cost for a long time. But at least they get the things done, is what I think the view is. And Africa, of course, badly needs infrastructure. And I think there is a tendency, perhaps in the West, I mean, and what the Africans will also say to you is, well, it's not as though we flourished when Western influence in Africa was unchallenged. I mean, groups like the Wagner Group, who now have renamed themselves the Africa Corps, so they're making no bones about it. We are the Africa Corps. I've always been a little bit skeptical of people who say that, there are outsiders who just manipulate the Africans like gormless, puppets on a string, and just create the conflicts and so on. Of course, what they do interfere and do exacerbate and will prop up one side against another, but there's usually another outside player who comes in. So yes, they do exacerbate, instability in these places, but they don't create the problems in the first place. They may just try to benefit. But of course, the collaboration between elites in Africa and some outside players does result in capital flight, resources being, taken away. We know that about Sudan, with some of the gold being taken on Russian planes and traded, in the world. There's a lot of gold in Sudan. One of the reasons why, there are outside players there is partly because of that. So I would say that looking economically at what has happened to Africa, and I don't really go too much into the colonial era because a lot of people have done that, and it's not where I thought I had added value. I wanted to do the stuff that's hidden, and there are many things about, the impact of colonialism. But what I would say is that the legacy of colonialism dealt Africa a bad hand, but African elites and rulers have made that bad hand worse, is what I would say. Where they could have made it better, but they made it worse.
One question that's come in was, did you have any views about South Africa trying to accuse, taking obviously Israel to the International Criminal Court for poor human rights? And I suspect that that's a surprise for many people in the UK, although I don't find it so surprising myself from having obviously been in South Africa. What is your sort of feeling about that, as it were, a different point of view that perhaps we hadn't sort of fully appreciated?
Yeah, I mean, I think that South Africa has always, because of its history with, white minority rule for such a long time, and it was the last country in Africa to gain its independence, so to speak, when Nelson Mandela became president in April 1994. So it's always had very strong links with what it perceives as, people who are oppressed or occupied or disenfranchised. So I think it's no surprise that it has done what it has done, because, as I said, it's always seen itself in that role. I mean, when Nelson Mandela was released in 1990, one of the first countries he visited was Algeria in the far north of the country.
Yes.
And, that's very much an example of how, despite the fact that there are 54 countries in Africa with very different, histories and so on, that this common experience of suffering from, foreign occupation, the French in Algeria, in the South Africans' case by the white South Africans, he sees a kind of unity there. And so I think that the heirs of the ANC, Mandela's heirs, are doing the same thing by taking this case at the International Court of Justice. I mean, it's interesting to note that when Umar al-Bashir visited South Africa and he was indicted by the International Criminal Court, that the South Africans didn't do anything then, but, very different situation, very different case.
Yeah. I think my final question to you is, you bring out so powerfully in your book, I think, the sort of the impact of successive economic and political issues in terms of, I think at one stage you talk about the polarization and the sort of the sense of people very much grouping together into their sort of countries, their cultures, in order to protect themselves against the deprivations of slavery or colonialism subsequently. And my word, it is a very diverse and enormous continent. And yet so many of the solutions, it seems, not just infrastructure and transportation, lie particularly in combining and working together on solutions. And certainly it's a very young continent, and it has a lot of young people who can't always get the right sort of jobs or exercise their skills. When you were talking to young graduates and young students, Zainab, did you get the impression that they were thinking Pan-African wise, that they did want to kind of join together and do things? Is there sort of a, African Union, after all, is there, and it seeks to impose and to do this and to channel that energy, but it seems very hard to get that really, really buzzing. And there are lots of places of excellence, but hard to get the sort of the thread wound more strongly.
I think you're very right, Judith. I mean, I think as the memory of colonialism recedes more and more, and it has for young people, they don't have too much truck with that.
No.
The idea of Pan-Africanism has really receded to a very large extent. I would hope it's a light sleeper, that it can be, reawakened. I think that the COVID vaccine debacle, as the Africans saw it, what Cyril Ramaphosa in South Africa termed vaccine apartheid, when Western countries had triple vaccinated their children, their people, and the Africans had not had the first dose. And going back to Professor Christian Happy, one of Africa's most eminent scientists, and also John Ngesenaku, who was the head of the Center for Disease Control for Africa, they wrote a very powerful paper and said, listen, this is a wake-up call for Africans. There is no alternative to relying on ourselves. Self-reliance is the most important thing. Greater collaboration within the continent, between regions across the continent also, because, this is what happens when the chips are down. We are, at the back of the queue. So I think that really did. I mean, I've never known Africans so angry, actually. And I think that even for young people, that it has perhaps excited in them a desire for, mobilizing their own domestic resources, putting fire in the belly of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, which was signed in 2018, to have a combined market. So I think that, that one of the legacies of the COVID outbreak is that perhaps it has made Africans more aware that they need a blueprint, which is much more, self-reliance. And there are lots of powerful advocates for Africa on the international scene, like Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the Director General of the World Trade Organization, Gilbert Angbo, also at the ILO, the International Labour Organization, Dr. Tedros, Director General of the World Health Organization, Amina Mohammed, Deputy Secretary General of the UN, and they're very aware of what's going on. And I think that, there are these very senior Africans at the top table, and I think they are becoming more powerful advocates for Africa. So I would say that, yes, young people perhaps not as plugged into Pan-Africanism, but in a kind of new form, 21st century form, with economics at its base, hopefully will happen. I mean, we know Africa trades very little. Intra-African trade is about 20%. In Europe, it's about 70%. In Asia, it's about 60%. And, these things must change. And I think there is an appetite for people to change.
Thank you. I mean, I think there are some sort of, unhelpful statistics out there showing that post-COVID, global supply chains have broken down much more into regional supply chains at this moment in time. And one comes back to the importance of the amount of development aid that we and other countries do put into Africa, not as much as we would have liked, and that was affected by COVID, but it does need to be used intelligently and in absolutely what Africans themselves want to do, and how it can be a real partnership. And I think that's a bit of a sort of, challenge to us, but hopefully one that we can rise to. And I think, your book has magnificently set out. It's opened, I mean, that wonderful quote by William Hague on the front cover, I just learned something on every page. And I thought, me too. And I've lived there, so thank you very, very much for your energy, your time, your insights.
Thank you.
Simon, you can come in now and do some some work for us. Thank you. Thank you again.
Thanks very much for that. I mean, Zeb, can I just say, we were led to you by our speaker of a couple of years ago, who said we should have a look at Africa. That was actually Mark Sedwill. And we were able to do that through Judith's good offices and your willingness to be here. And so thank you very much for doing that. It's taken us down a track that, we've not followed before. And that is great, because that's what we're here for. And all the time you were speaking, I had an image in my head, which was when I was doing an international relations MPhil. One of my lecturers came from Sierra Leone, had been a assistant under secretary in the UN, was lecturing at Cambridge, had a son in the British Army. And the only thought I couldn't get out of my head was what a loss he was to his own country.
Yeah.
And it was just quite striking. And I think you've kind of put that over tonight. And thank you so much for taking the time to do that. We look forward to your TV series. I've got it noted down on a piece of scruffy paper in my study, and I shall follow it assiduously.
Me too.
Thank you
very much indeed. And the only thing to say now is that we will put this out as a link in the next few days. So people who've missed it, who couldn't be here to listen to it live, will be able to pick it up, and they will find it, I think, riveting. So thank you very much. We always make a donation to a charity of your choice, which in your case is St Hilda's Development Fund in Oxford, and we will do that within the next 24 hours. So thank you again. And it would be wrong of me not to promote the next speaker, forgive me, who is going to be Mark Lyle Grant on the 13th of November at Marjan University. So for all our alumni who are listening, please put that in your diary. So finally, thank you so much for being with us tonight, and please enjoy your supper.
Thank you so much, Simon, and thank you, Judith. Fabulous colleague to have, Judith, and thank you to everybody who was listening in. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you.
Good.
Thank you.
It's very good time.